when we talk about reasoning, these are opposite ways of reasoning. And so I want to just explain them. So reasoning from first principles, it's a physics term. First principles are kind of the axioms, what we know for sure. You know, the laws of gravity, the things we know for sure. And what we do is we use those as, what physicists do is they use those as puzzle pieces. And they construct a conclusion. And that conclusion, you could, if you ask them where it comes from, it's always based on axioms, first principles. And they use those, and they build a conclusion, and then that's a theory, and then it can be tested, and they go from there. But we all kind of have this situation. If, you know, I think of it as, you know, the first principles of any given situation, whether it's at work or outside of work, or the way you're living your life, to think about what are the actual facts here. That's a harder question than it might seem, to actually step back and say, what are the first principles? What are we really working with? You know, what's our budget? What are the possibilities out in the world? Not in the world that we just came from, but what today, often if you actually look, the tools and the opportunities and the way the culture is shifting is different. So the first principles change. You can use that to construct a different conclusion about the best way to do your job, the best way that, how should HR be? So here's an example. Steve Jobs wanted to get into the phone business. So he didn't say, well, what's our keyboard going to look like? Let's make it a nice, you know, clicky, Apple-y keyboard, and let's make it look. He just stepped back and said, what should a mobile phone be? What should a mobile device be in the future? And they reasoned from principles based on the cutting-edge technology that was available and their own reasoning. And when they got to the top, the conclusion they had no keyboard. And what they did is they revolutionized the entire industry because every other company was just copying their previous thing. That's reasoning by analogy. Reasoning by analogy is taking the existing conclusions that are out there. Sometimes you came up with them 10 years ago and you're just kind of running on that now. Sometimes it's the conclusions of conventional wisdom or everyone else. But what they were doing is just taking the existing conclusions, and they were saying, I guess that's how it has to be, because that's how everyone's doing it, and they were just doing that, and that is our nature. Reasoning by analogy is a great shortcut. Inventing the wheel with every single conclusion is actually hugely laborious. And so we cut corners by looking at other people's existing conclusions and stealing their hard work, and that's a great thing most of the time. But in the really important things, like how you drive your direction of your career or your business, or how you live your life outside of it, it's actually not usually a very good idea. Conventional wisdom usually runs behind. So again, back to the iPhone, Steve Jobs didn't reason by analogy and say, you know, let's make one that looks like this, but better. Just started from scratch and say, what could this be? Ignored all the other conclusions. Changed the world, invented something, and so a lot of people think Steve Jobs is a genius, and a lot of people think that originals, great originals, are geniuses, but I don't think that's true. I think that they are very good at just ignoring conventional wisdom, and they understand a counterintuitive fact, which is that conventional wisdom is not actually that wise. It's often, in a rapidly changing industry, or rapidly changing world, it lags behind. And so when you realize that, then you realize that reasoning from first principles actually makes sense. My own reasoning, I think, actually conflicts with conventional wisdom, and I'm going to trust it. That's what Steve Jobs did. That's what Elon Musk does. That's what a lot of these real originals do, is that they're not you know, Einstein. It's that they just trust their own original reasoning. So I would challenge you, and I have a little kind of, it's just a way to remember this. I think of it as a cook and a chef. The chef is on the left here. The chef uses the first principles in the chef's world are the raw ingredients of food, right? And just, I'm going to experiment. I'm going to try putting this on this and just kind of, maybe this, I always thought these two might go well together, even though it's not. And the chef's going to make a lot of bad food. But when the chef does hit something good, everyone's going to, you know, suddenly it's this new thing and everyone wants to try it and it's going to get all this attention. And most people are not. Most people, are, most of us, most of the time, are cooks. And I use the word cook to mean someone who just follows a recipe. So the chef invents the recipe by experimentation and original reasoning, and the cook follows the recipe. So there was a recipe for mobile phones, and Steve Jobs went into chef mode instead of cook mode. He invented his own recipe, and then everyone started copying his new recipe. And so thinking about your work, I don't know exactly what part of your work this is relevant in, but it's definitely relevant somewhere. Whether it's the way you're managing your team, or the way you're interfacing with your clients, or there's so many different processes and things and recipes that you're currently going by. And pause for a second and ask, who wrote this recipe and when? Is this from 50 years ago and everyone's just continuing to kind of do this because that's how things are done? Is it written by our boss 10 years ago and we haven't really reconsidered? Did I write this 10 years ago and I'm just kind of continuing to do this? It's really important to pause and do this